It's apparent that U.S. imperialism has suffered severe reputational damage. That is to say, uh, many were wondering during the recently concluded Olympics why Israeli athletes were participating, but not Russian athletes. That is to say, is there some sort of double standard in the world? Some are asking naively. The short answer is yes, of course, there is a double standard. And at the same time, a number of hawks in the United States are rather miffed that they cannot turn with laser like focus to focus on China, which they see as the big enchilada. They see China as the major threat to U.S. hegemony in the 21st century. But once again, they're bogged down in West Asia, bogged down in Israel. And this is causing frazzled nerves, not least within the Zionist lobby of the United States of America, although they're trying vainly to hide their frazzled nerves. So the short answer to your question is that resistance is obviously complicating the path of Israel and its U.S. ally. In 1991, a Nazi, David Duke, got 55% of the Euro-American vote running for governor of Louisiana. It took a massive turnout from the Black community to prevent a Nazi from seizing power legitimately in Louisiana, another former slave-owning state. So I'm afraid to say that many of my friends on the left, they don't like to grapple with these realities. I guess they're too complicated, it's too discouraging, or they emulate the fictional French intellectual who says, I know what you're saying is true in practice. The question is it true in theory? That is to say, they have a theory of the case, and they stick to that theory of the case, irrespective of the facts, for example. And that's one of the reasons why in this country we always seem to be staring down the barrel of fascism.
Okay, hello everyone. So we have a good friend of the show again on, Professor Gerald Horn. In all honesty, one of our very favorite guests. Um, he needs not much introduction. Written approximately 50 books about radicalism, white supremacy, you name it. He's a professor at the University of Houston. And today, in light of all the happenings around the world, we invited you, Professor Horn, to actually discuss something that is back high on the agenda, and that is actually resistance. Okay, well,
Mm.
resistance to empire, resistance to the system that we are in, and especially in light of all the things that happen in Israel Palestine. We wanted to discuss that with you because you have a huge knowledge about resistance, also historically speaking. So before we start, Professor Horn, I'd like to just ask you a general question about what is your current assessment of the situation in Palestine and also
Mm-hmm.
the resistance that we see against it.
Well, it's very complicated. As you know, a few weeks ago, the piratical regime in Israel engaged in typical murder incorporated tactics by assassinating a leader of Hezbollah, the South Lebanese resistance movement, and slapping Iran in the face on the day of the inauguration of the new president by assassinating a leader of Hamas who was there for the inauguration, though, of course, the Israelis have not claimed credit, at least for the latter. Since that time, and perhaps I should mention that today is August 19th, 2024, those assassinations happened a few weeks ago, and many of us had expected a retaliation by the axis of resistance spearheaded by Iran. But now, since as of this moment, a retaliation has not taken place, I think it's possible to recalibrate and rethink what's going on. That is to say, that it's apparent that Prime Minister Netanyahu of Israel was seeking to rope in the United States into his diabolical scheme by somehow enticing Iran to attack Israel, and then the United States, which has a long-term objective of toppling the Islamic regime, could then join in to that end. And as you know, to that end, there is a major U.S. flotilla in the neighborhood, including a nuclear submarine, believe it or not. We also know that Moscow has sent high-level representation to Tehran, presumably to bolster the regime, and this is leading to real fears that we could stumble into World War III if we're not careful. And the Pentagon, in that context, has mentioned that Russian and Chinese jets have been buzzing Alaska in recent days, believe it or not. At the same time, Israel is going through an existential crisis all its own because the economy is imploding. The Israeli military is built to fight short wars. Recall the Six-Day War of June 1967, for example. They're heavily dependent upon reserves, that is to say, individuals who are accustomed to stocking grocery shelves and sitting in office cubicles, and now they're on the front lines. They've been on the front lines for 10 months or so. They are exhausted, according to press reports, which makes all the more curious the story that appeared in the Wall Street Journal a few days ago that suggested that Israel was going to engage in a preemptive strike against Hezbollah and the Iranians because they were tired of waiting for the Axis of Resistance retaliation. Excuse my chuckling, but it's so absurd, I feel I have no choice. Also, you see in Israel, in terms of the imploding of the economy, that there are a number of Israeli nationals with two passports, and many who have two passports are seeking the opportunity to flee. And let me footnote here the film by U.S. filmmaker Steven Spielberg, Munich, which I recommend. And at the final scene, which, and of course, the movie deals with the attack on Israeli athletes at the Olympics in 1972 and the Israeli retaliation. In the final scene, of course, you have Israelis fleeing to Brooklyn, of all places. And so you have art imitating life and life imitating art, because that's what's happening now. Israeli nationals with two passports are fleeing. At the same time, Hamas has shown itself to be quite adaptive with regard to combating the Israelis. In fact, there was an article on the front page of the New York Times just a few days ago that said that Israel has reached the end of the line with regard to its stated goal of crushing Hamas. In other words, U.S. intelligence suggests that that goal will not be attained, which is quite remarkable when this was not necessarily expected. At the same time, the Yemeni allies of the Axis of Resistance have suggested that we are in a new stage with regard to resistance to Israeli piracy, because they've imposed de facto sanctions on the Israeli economy through their action of patrolling the Suez Canal, which leads into depositing goods in the Israeli port of Eilat, E-I-L-A-T, which is now going through a kind of mini depression because of these de facto sanctions by the Yemeni allies of the Axis of Resistance. So it's apparent that U.S. imperialism has suffered severe reputational damage. That is to say, many were wondering during the recently concluded Olympics why Israeli athletes were participating, but not Russian athletes. That is to say, is there some sort of double standard in the world? Some are asking naively. The short answer is yes, of course, there is a double standard. And at the same time, a number of hawks in the United States or rather miffed that they cannot turn with laser-like focus to focus on China, which they see as the big enchilada. They see China as the major threat to U.S. hegemony in the 21st century. But once again, they're bogged down in West Asia, bogged down in Israel. And this is causing frazzled nerves, not least within the Zionist lobby of the United States of America, although they're trying vainly to hide their frazzled nerves. So the short answer to your question is that resistance is obviously complicating the path of Israel and its U.S. ally.
And I couldn't resist asking you this question because I've heard so many people talk about, the Democratic Convention in Chicago and the historical resonance of that, the fact that there was a very unpopular war at the same time. What do you think about the parallels between that Democratic Convention in Chicago and the one going on today? Do you think that there's any possibility of this convention having any sort of tangible impact? Or rather, the protests against it?
Well, I trust and I hope that the protests will have significant impact. There are parallels, to be sure, Vietnam versus historic Palestine. Lyndon Baines Johnson, 1968, stepping down in favor of his vice president, Hubert Horatio Humphrey. Joseph R. Biden stepping down in favor of his vice president, Kamala Harris. Protests in the streets, although the protests in the streets in Chicago as we speak, although the headline issue is Gaza, it's actually a multi-issue protest. I mean, police terror is on the agenda, women's reproductive freedom is on the agenda, workers' rights is on the agenda with regard to this protest. But I would say the most significant difference, and perhaps the telling difference, is that in 1968, you had the pugnacious mayor, Richard Daley, in office in Chicago, who was not adverse to sicking police on protesters. The current mayor, Brandon Johnson, a Black American, elected not least because of a sizable turnout by the Black community, has spoken, believe it or not, of genocide unfolding in historic Palestine. And this is a palpable difference. But at the same time, what we have to realize about the United States is that you have a lot of rogue elements in this society. I'm reading this book now by Matthew Connelly. It's called The Declassified Engine. And it's about many things, but one of the sub-themes is that the national security establishment of the United States is totally out of control. I mean, just in terms of your neck of the woods, for example, he's looking historically, mostly post 1941. And so he talks about how the U.S. commander in post-war Japan during the war with Korea, 1950 to 1953, wants to launch World War III, attacking the newly minted People's Republic of China. And President Truman does not want him to. President Truman fires him. And so therefore we escape World War III. But since that time, not only does the U.S. military, the Joint Chiefs of Staff, they hold meetings and don't take minutes, according to this book. And also that they destroy records on a regular basis. So it's hard to know what they've done or what they're doing. They conduct experiments on marginalized groups, particularly Black Americans. I'm talking about the U.S. military, the U.S. intelligence forces. Just in the past few days, the progressive radio station in Washington that I often speak on, WPFW-FM, their signal has been disrupted. Scott Ritter, who is a well-known U.S. dissident with regard to the war in historic Palestine and in Ukraine, his home was raided. You have Black political dissidents on trial in Florida because of their opposition to U.S. foreign policy. So, despite what some might interpret as my rather rosy view of what's going to unfold in Chicago in the next few days, you can't rule anything out in this country because there are just so many rogue elements, and rogue elements with regard to conservatism in particular. We already know that with regard to this presidential election, that irrespective of what the vote totals are, just like January 6th, 2021, you're going to have an effort by the right wing to seize victory, to seize power. I mean, like this is St. Petersburg in 1917, for example. So it's difficult to predict what's going to happen in Chicago, but some of us remain optimistic.
Yeah, I don't know if it was covered in your book. Sorry, Kareem. I just wanted to.
No. Go ahead. Go ahead.
With an anecdote. There was this story I learned about only recently during the whole spy balloon hullabaloo. There was a historian who wrote a book on this CIA operation called Operation Tropic, not Operation Tropic Thunder, just Operation Tropic. And this was soon after the war. They, rather during the Korean War. They picked up a bunch of dissidents in Hong Kong, flew them to, I forget, Philippines or Taiwan for training, and then airdropped them over the mainland under the plan or the belief that they would just go around and say, hey, fellow comrades, let's rise up and overthrow the tyrannical regime so that we can institute capitalist democracy. And that was an actual plan. They actually believed that would have currency with common people throughout China as they airdrop these people in. I wonder if that's going to be covered. I only learned about it because a historian who wrote a book on that wrote an article kind of debunking the craze in the U.S. I think it was actually in Foreign Policy. But at any rate, it was a amazing story.
Well, there's a new neoconservative book out. Excuse my chuckling, but what I'm talking about is so absurd. It's called We Win, You Lose. It's about the U.S. approach to China, basically. And that's the title of the book. I mean, in the article in Foreign Affairs, which is the publication of the Council on Foreign Relations, which is this elite think tank on the Upper East Side of Manhattan in New York City, just this year, in one of their front page cover stories, the cover story was about overthrowing the Communist Party of China. And that should be the goal of U.S. foreign policy. It's now, obviously, the state that's quite dangerous, but that is a goal of an increasing segment of not only the U.S. ruling class, but keep in mind that with regard to the two major parties, there are differences on Ukraine. The Trump team wants to cut a deal with Moscow so that it can focus like a laser beam on China. The Democrats, I think, are overestimating the strength of U.S. imperialism because they want to combat both. They want to fight China and Russia simultaneously. They feel that with the assistance of the European Union to confront Russia and Ukraine, they can accomplish that dual agenda. And of course, with the assistance in Asia of Japan, Republic of Korea, Australia, and of course, India, they feel that they can accomplish that goal of confronting China. Now, of course, there's a lot of dissent in Japan and Australia, and to a degree in India as well, with regard to tagging behind Uncle Sam, but Uncle Sam remains confident.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly. Thank you for that answer. So I to jump a bit on what you just said, speaking of rogue elements, the resistance that we see right now against the genocide, for example, the student protests, which is, in my opinion, I really admire those students putting themselves on the line for what is happening. But on the other hand, it seems that there is not much progress, I feel. And now I also hear that a lot of the people who are behind the resistance are now getting behind Kamala Harris, as if they haven't learned a thing. My question is, Professor Horn, do you agree that there is not much progress when it comes to the resistance, and what can people do to be more effective?
Well, I'm not so sure. I mean, the president of Columbia University, uh, who has roots in both the UK and Egypt, she helped to trigger the entire national movement, if not international movement, by her crackdown on encampment protesters at this upper west side of Manhattan campus. She just resigned. Not only did she resign, but she's leaving the country. She says, "I'm out of here." She's going back to London, which is very interesting. Not only leaving Columbia, not only leaving New York City, not only leaving the United States, but going back to London. I mean, I found that to be quite a commentary. And at the same time, there's a lot of nervousness on these campuses because campuses are reopening. We fully expect the encampment protests to continue and to accelerate. We expect more sophisticated tactics. And of course, we also know that there have been ancillary victories. I mean, for example, Intel, which is a major Silicon Valley corporation, canceled a multi-billion-dollar investment in Israel, as not only, of course, as a result of the encampment, but as a result of the war and a result of the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement, which has a headquarters in the United States of America. And at the same time, I mentioned a few moments ago the hysteria that's coming to grip the Zionist lobby of the United States. Now, of course, they have matters they can boast about. They've been going after left-leaning Black members of Congress and have been somewhat successful in defeating them. But at the same time, they're raising this phony issue that the Democrats did not choose their man, Governor Shapiro of Pennsylvania, a former volunteer for the Israeli military, by the way, that the fact that Kamala Harris didn't pick him as a vice presidential nominee and took Governor Walz of Minnesota instead, that reflects anti-Jewish bigotry. Now, I've been warning the Zionist lobby that just as an overuse of antibiotics can compromise ultimate efficacy, the overuse of this term anti-Semitism can really compromise the efficacy of the campaign against this pestilence, for example. And I think that the Zionist lobby may be overplaying their hand, as I pointed out before. Part of the problem in the United States of America is that the right wing historically has been so powerful, so potent, so strong that it's easy for them to overestimate their strength. I mean, it's understandable. And thus, 1860, 1861, the slave owners who owned my ancestors, they could have cut a deal with the government of Abraham Lincoln and perhaps extended their reign at least for a few more decades. But they overestimated their strength and wound up losing it all, including their most valuable investment, the investment in enslaved Africans. And I'm warning the Zionist lobby, not careful, they can walk down that same path, that they can overestimate their strength and wind up enduring significant victories. And then let me move from that somewhat factual analysis to speculation. Speculation being that I would like to think that some of the billionaires who support the Zionist lobby, I'm thinking of Bill Ackman of Pershing Capital, for example, who takes for the overthrowing of the first Black president of Harvard University, speaking of the daughter of Haitian immigrants, Claudine Gay, because she was not sufficiently enthusiastic about genocide in Palestine. So since he claimed that scalp, he's been trying to raise money for an IPO, initial public offering, to increase his billions, and has had difficulty doing so. And I would like to think that the reason he's had difficulty is because of a negative reaction to his political stance. Because billionaires, when they get involved in politics, as Elon Musk, South African born, will come to find, that they can generate quite a bit of opposition to their detriment.
Speaking of billionaires, this is an odd transition, but I wanted to get your thoughts about the foreign policy of one of the two major candidates. So the polls make it look like it's essentially a toss-up race now between Trump and Harris. Have you been looking at their advisors on foreign policy to try to come up with your best estimate of what a U.S. foreign policy under Trump or Harris might look like? Certainly, I mean, there's within the Republican Party, their foreign policy establishment, there's a little bit of tension whether to go the pivot to Asia route or to keep up the focus on Russia. I don't really know what to make of Trump because he's such a, well, idiot is one short way of putting it, but it doesn't seem like someone with his own deep-seated ideology. It doesn't seem like someone who's sat and read and thought a lot about foreign policy and would probably follow the advice of his top advisors. So do you have any sense of any differences or continuities in what U.S. foreign policy would likely look like under these two?
Well, first, a recent story in the Washington Post that speaks to why it's difficult to predict the trajectory of Trump foreign policy. Apparently, in October 2016, when he had pledged to contribute his own money to the campaign, according to the Washington Post, the story just broke a few weeks ago, I think it was $10 million was put in cash in Cairo in canvas bags and brought to Mr. Trump, who then uses the money for a late electoral push. And then after he is victorious, one of the first visitors to the White House is General al-Sisi, the leader in Egypt, who he subsequently denotes as his favorite dictator. And what's striking about Mr. Trump is that it's obvious that he can be bought. And that's another wild card with regard to U.S. foreign policy, for example, because another Egyptian story is that the senior senator from the state of New Jersey, Senator Menendez, who was a Cuban American, he just resigned because he was taking bribes from the Egyptians. And then that was shaping his ability to form U.S. foreign policy from his perch as a major shaper of congressional foreign policy in Washington. So we only know rather accidentally about these kinds of stories. So who knows what other kinds of stories are unfolding with regard to U.S. politicians being on the take. And then, of course, in your neck of the woods, the man we know as Miles Kwok, Kwok. I don't know if you know that name. He's a dissident a Chinese mogul who lives in the United States. He has been close to Steve Bannon, who's now serving jail time, a former top advisor to Mr. Trump, and was helping to shape foreign policy towards Beijing. But with that out of the way, let's turn to your question, which is that I think with regard to Trump foreign policy, we can expect rifts with erstwhile U.S. allies in Europe, for example. He expects them to spend more on defense, which is another way to say that he expects more European taxpayers to send checks to the military industrial complex of the United States, to Lockheed Martin, to Northrop Grumman, to Boeing, which is going through quite a difficult patch right now. You can expect that approach to exacerbate rifts within the European Union because Mr. Trump will curry favor with Poland, with the Baltics, for example, and not necessarily with France. As a matter of fact, one of the stories that emerged with regard to his taking documents from the White House and storing them at his mansion in Mar-a-Lago was that part of the documents he was storing contained secrets about the life of President Macron. Apparently, he had dirt on President Macron, which of course he would probably use to seek to gain influence, to maybe even seek to bribe him. Who knows? That's one of the stories that emerge. Of course, you can expect similar pressure in Latin America, particularly in Venezuela, and particularly on Cuba, and particularly on Mexico. Recall that during the Trump tenure from 2017 to 2021, he had to be discouraged from invading Mexico. At least he said he wanted to invade Mexico. I mean, it was a threat because he felt that Mexico was complicit in the influx of drugs to the United States and wasn't doing enough to stop refugees and immigrants from crossing the border from Mexico into the United States of America. With regard to Africa, to coin a phrase from the Nixon era, there'll probably be a kind of benign neglect. For example, Mr. Trump does not have a very high opinion of Africa. He's referred to those countries in that continent, I guess I'll just say it, as shithole countries, for example. Now, with regard to a Harris foreign policy, as I suggested, I think that the Democrats are overestimating the strength of U.S. foreign policy. They will probably try to continue the conflict in Ukraine and conjunction with so-called European allies, and then continue this conflict with China. Mr. Trump says that he's going to slap tariffs on Chinese goods. And, you know, he's such a wild man. As you suggested, it's hard to know if you should take that seriously, even though it would be quite a blow to the U.S. economy if he were to do so, and perhaps even injurious to the Chinese economy as well. But that's what he's been saying. I wouldn't expect the Harris team to go down that route to try to increase tariffs against China. But what your audience needs to understand is the different political base of both countries. Both parties, excuse me. That is to say that there's a split in the U.S. ruling class, obviously, with regard to the Democrats and Republicans. There's even a split in Silicon Valley, which is Kamala Harris's base, or that's, she comes from Oakland, Berkeley, just due north of Silicon Valley. And with some of the billionaire interests, such as Peter Thiel, a Palantir, which is sort of a data mining firm. He has roots in apartheid South Africa, like Elon Musk, as do, interestingly enough, a number of leading figures in Silicon Valley, including Roelof Botha, who is one of the major venture capitalists in Silicon Valley. So Peter Thiel, Thiel, he's a supporter historically of Trump. He basically created J.D. Vance, the present vice presidential running mate, because he hired him after Yale Law School, helped to finance his campaign victoriously for the U.S. Senate, etc. Then you have others in Silicon Valley, like Reed Hastings of Netflix. In fact, the entire Netflix team is pro-Harris. let us say, executive team. The spouse of Ted Sarandos, who is co-chief executive of Netflix, happens to be a Black woman and is close person to Kamala Harris, for example. She was formerly just off the coast of Florida. Her father, Clarence Avant, was a chief executive in the entertainment industry. And so, with regard to the ruling elite, generally in the United States, it's fair to say that entertainment industry interests like Jeff Katzenberg, a billionaire out of Hollywood, are pro-Democrat. A lot of the celebrities, George Clooney, Barbara Streisand, et cetera, are pro-Democrat. Whereas the Republican strength, which is something difficult for many of our friends on the left to accept, is amongst the Euro-American middle class, the shopkeepers, the auto dealers, and of course, billionaires like Peter Thiel, who I just mentioned, and of course, the Euro-American working class, which is something difficult to accept. And as I've been pointing out in some of my writing lately, this has a lot to do with settler colonialism. And I should have mentioned this in talking about the student protesters, because of their protests of Israel, they've helped to reintroduce the concept of settler colonialism into the political vocabulary of the United States, which has been quite profound and quite significant. Because when people look across the Atlantic and espy settler colonialism, it makes it easier to espy settler colonialism on this side of the Atlantic, which, believe it or not, has not been the case until quite recently. And what's interesting about settler colonialism, as I pointed out in my work, is that it's a class collaborationist enterprise. If you look at the 1580s, when London first began to send settlers across the Atlantic to what they call North Carolina, it was a heterogeneous collection of English folk from various class backgrounds sponsored by the elite in London. And they had a mutual interest in taking the land from the Native Americans, which they succeeded in doing, and then manacling Africans, my ancestors, to bring them across the Atlantic to work for free, to create this superpower. But it was a class collaborationist enterprise. And class collaborationism, you also saw on January 6, 2021, an attempt to prevent the peaceful transfer of power, because you had CEOs flying in on private jets, you had shopkeepers, you had military veterans, you had declassed elements, you had working class elements, disproportionately from Florida and Texas, two former slave-owning states, by the way, all united on a common platform. This gives the Republicans quite an advantage, because in states like Mississippi, for example, believe it or not, we already know that in the election, the Republicans will get 90% of the Euro-American vote across class lines, 90%. In 1991, a Nazi, David Duke, got 55% of the Euro-American vote running for governor of Louisiana. It took a massive turnout from the Black community to prevent a Nazi from seizing power legitimately in Louisiana, another former slave-owning state. So I'm afraid to say that many of our friends on the left, they don't like to grapple with these realities. I guess they're too complicated, it's too discouraging, or they emulate the fictional French intellectual who says, I know what you're saying is true in practice. The question is it true in theory? That is to say, they have a theory of the case, and they stick to that theory of the case irrespective of the facts, for example. And that's one of the reasons why in this country we always seem to be staring down the barrel of fascism.
Yeah, definitely. And as psychologists, we as social and political psychologists, there's something that always baffles me so much, but it's very interesting to see that it's just simply the power, the immense psychological power of the construct of race. The fact that the identity of white is so incredibly powerful that people who have nothing in common with billionaires support those billionaires more than others who pretty much share everything with them. It's a social class, job, could be hobby, religion, doesn't matter, but they don't share the same skin color. And just because you share the same skin color, you share the same racial identity, you support somebody who is a billionaire far off of who you are, much easier. You see more in common with that person than your neighbor who has the same hobbies, the same job, the same class, but just a different skin color. It's just baffling to me how that invention of whiteness, you could say, and of course that went organic, is so powerful in inducing this cross-class collaboration that you are talking about. It still baffles me how that goes on today, you know. But on the other hand, I also think that may actually be eventually the downfall of the West, because it has really separated the West from people around the world. And you also see that in activism, in my opinion. The fact that there's, it's for the left, or as you say, our friends on the left, often so difficult in the West to bind with other resistance movements around the world. I think that the idea of race and whiteness plays a huge role in that. What would you say about that, Professor Horn?
Well, sure. And as I said, it goes back to the origins of settler colonialism in this country. That is to say that historically, I think it's possible to state that many European settlers perceived that they received a benefit from this class collaboration. I mean, for example, in my Texas book, I talk about when 200 years ago, the US President Andrew Jackson decided to expel the Native Americans from the southeast quadrant of this continent. And some of the Native Americans, particularly the Cherokees, had sought to assimilate. They had become Christians. They adapted the dress of the settlers. They published newspapers. They developed an alphabet in their language. They enslaved Africans. They became sedentary agriculturalists. But they still had to go. And oftentimes, figuratively, if not literally, as they were expelled, moving into their mansions, and some of them did have mansions, were Europeans fresh off the boat. And so that's difficult to quarrel with. I mean, the fact that you can arrive penniless from Europe and move into a mansion, for example. That's a, and so in some ways, I think that some of the poor supporters of Mr. Trump in places like Kentucky and Appalachia, the people who gave rise to J.D. Vance, for example, that they have, in a sense, a better instinctive, organic understanding of how the country was built through that kind of class collaboration where those defined as white unite against everyone else and then plunder and loot them. And in fact, I mean, here's a rather troublesome anecdote about, let's say, a few years ago here in Houston. I was speaking at a solidarity rally in favor of Palestinians. And I was making what I consider to be rather antiseptic, anodyne comments. You know, your struggle is our struggle. We're the same. You're facing settler colonialism. We're facing settler colonialism. A number of the Palestinians objected. I mean, it was including scholars, because looking retrospectively, I see that, as we say in the Black community, I mean, they're melanin deficient. They can easily pass into the hollowed halls of whiteness. They don't have accents, for example, that would help to betray their origins. And so I guess they feel Maybe now they're objecting to U.S. foreign policy, but back then they were feeling rather comfortable, in terms of reprimanding, rebuking an ally. In fact, I'm still stunned by that. But on the other hand, I shouldn't be, because the point about this construction of whiteness in the United States, it's been very elastic. I mean, it's included Lebanese Christians, it's included Egyptian Christians. I mean, for example, I just referred to the fleeing of the former president of Columbia University. She was of Egyptian Christian origin. The woman who greets U.S. television viewers in the morning on one of the most popular morning shows, Hoda, her last name is spelled in an alliterated way, K-O-T-B. I don't know if that's Kotobo, whatever. She's Egyptian Christian. She's invited into the hallowed halls of whiteness. So Ralph Nader, who ran for president, he's Lebanese Christian. He's considered to be part of the hallowed halls of whiteness. So even though people like myself routinely use this term Euro-American, it's sort of a misnomer. Because note also, when I spoke of these other groups, Egyptian, for example, Lebanese, I mentioned Christian as part of their identity. And what that speaks to is the fact that preceding this era of race, which I argue is mostly a product of settler colonialism, the construction of capitalism, the plundering of the indigenous, the enslaving the Africans, you had, of course, religious conflict, Protestant versus Catholic, Christian versus Jewish, Muslim versus Christian. As a matter of fact, I'm reading a book now about Jewish folk in the U.S. South during the U.S. Civil War. Many of them were slave owners, by the way. And some of them are expressing concern about the impending abolition of slavery because they think that with a reduction of anti-Blackness, there'll be a rise of anti-Jewish bigotry. Now, I don't really think that happened, but I sort of understand historically why they were thinking that way. If they had a historical sense, they would realize that preceding this era of anti-Blackness, of course, was even a longer period of anti-Jewish bigotry, which is just beneath the surface in this country, which I've been trying to warn the Zionist lobby about.
Yeah, I would say that you see that with quite a few minority group members in across the West. You also saw that with the East Asian community, that often they would be perceived as you could say perceive themselves often you could say as proximal to white identity, but also after you got the whole anti-Asian effect of COVID-19, you also saw that sudden stronger kind of alliance with other marginalized groups. But I think there would be a difference, you could say, on a macro and more individual level. I would say that Palestinian Americans, for example, on an individual level, or Arab Americans on an individual level, often can pass for white within the societies that they're in. So let's say a Ralph Nader. But I would say on the macro level, when you compare Israel and Palestine, I think Palestine would never be included into the hallowed halls of whiteness, but Israel would. On a macro level, I would say Israel is perceived as a bastion of whiteness. Palestine is not. But on an individual level, a Palestinian American can pass for white, and it's the same with Turkish Europeans and Turkish Americans. They could pass for white any time of the day within our societies. But on a macro level, the majority Muslim country of Turkey would never be seen as part of the great white identity, so to speak. What do you say about that?
Oh, sure. And once again, I think the religious factor plays a role, particularly with regard to our Turkish friends. But with regard to Israel, Palestine, I think part of the issue with regard to some. I don't want to paint with too broad a brush, but say the people who were deriding me here in Texas after I was extending an olive branch of solidarity. Let's just limit it to those folks. That there's a sort of resentment that they're not part of the level of whiteness as the Jewish Americans are. I mean, that seems to be a gripe, but they need to get used to it because that's going to be very difficult to change. Not impossible, but difficult.
So we're getting close to the end of the hour. I wanted to try to find something, a topic that might leave us off on a hopeful note. So I was just thinking, you mentioned a class collaborationist project. It struck me that your book on South Africa was basically describing, you could think of it this way, as a class collaborationist project. Obviously apartheid, but also the resistance. You had people of all different social classes uniting there. Do you think there are any lessons from the eventually successful anti-apartheid movement? Of course, we don't have the USSR today to provide a hell of a lot of help. But nonetheless, do you think there are any lessons from the anti-apartheid movement that the Palestinian Solidarity Movement could learn from? And do you think it might also result in greater cross-class productive or socially beneficial collaboration?
Well, one of the advantages of the anti-apartheid movement, which is going to be difficult, although not impossible for the Palestinian Solidarity Movement to replicate, is that the fact that there were 40 million or are 40 million Black people in the United States of America who had an instinctive sympathy with the victims of apartheid, and that historically, going back decades, you had Black South Africans attending historically Black colleges and universities like Howard University, the alma mater of Vice President Harris, of Tuskegee in Alabama, et cetera. You had, in fact, as I mentioned, as I recall in opening pages of that book, a lot of marriages between Black people in Southern Africa and Black Americans. Ties of singular intimacy is the phrase often used to describe those sorts of relationships. And that creates a certain bonding, those sorts of personal relationships. And then another advantage in Southern Africa is that, as I try to point out in the book, the racists in South Africa were more Afrikaner nationalists than they were white supremacists, as evidenced by the fact that they had difficulty, to put it mildly, embracing Jewish migrants, for example. As I point out, a number of the leading figures in the anti-apartheid movement were Jewish. Joe Slovo, Ruth First, his late wife, for example. And these Afrikaners, of course, descendants of Dutch settlers, by the way, they had a hell of a time absorbing those Jewish refugees, which was obviously a blow.
Even
also,
Catholics, right?
Sorry?
Even Catholics, right?
Even Catholics, Greeks, they were really ethnic chauvinists, masquerading as white supremacists.
They're typically descendants of the Dutch, yes.
Masquerading as white supremacists. They were fake white supremacists. They were not authentic white supremacists. And so that was basically handing weapons to their antagonists. They sort of painted themselves into a corner. Now, with regard to the Zionist lobby, it's possible, almost inherently, that they'll make the same mistake, because obviously Israel is an exclusivist apartheid regime. Obviously, privileges are doled out on an ethno-religious basis. Historically, of course, part of the success of settler colonialism in North America has been incorporating the Jewish minority. But at a certain point, it's easy to predict that there are going to be fissures between the Jewish minority in the United States, the Zionist lobby in the United States, and the overall U.S. ruling class, particularly as U.S. imperialism suffers reputational damage because of its alliance with Israel, particularly as U.S. imperialism would like to turn towards focusing like a laser beam on China, but yet they're bogged down in West Asia. That's going to lead to strains. And I'm not sure if the Zionist lobby is ready for that. I would also say that with regard to the Palestinian solidarity movement, at the latter stages of the anti-apartheid movement, and you're sort of developing this in the Palestinian solidarity movement, at least in this country, there were membership organizations. I mean, you have that to a certain degree with allied organizations like Jewish Voices for Peace, for example, if not now. But they have offices, they have significant streams of funding. A lot of the Black celebrity class funded these organizations, for example. The Palestine Solidarity Movement can, I think, gain access to like-minded streams of funding, because ultimately, if they're going to be successful, you really have to have membership organizations, you have to have offices, you have to have conferences and conventions, for example. It can't just be this sort of decentralized movement of campuses erupting with encampments like mushrooms after a spring rain. It has to be more organized. Now, I understand why you have this decentralized movement, because, as I say, you have all these rogue elements in this country, right-wing rogue elements, and they're very disruptive and very powerful. And the response from our movement is to be leaderless. So you can't decapitate the leadership because there are no leaders, basically, which sort of works. But at a certain point, you're really going to have to challenge these rogue elements and put them in their place.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more on the importance of actually having an organization with offices. Basically, it just means people who are paid, who get their bread and their shelter from working all day to advance the goals of the organization and to give people orders so that you have the sum is greater than the total of the parts, or however the phrase goes. I think you know the meaning. But yeah, I think that is a big problem on the left is I don't know, reading too much 60s, 70s French intellectuals, and they're so afraid of power. So they don't want to actually have that kind of organization, or they don't like hierarchy so much that they don't want to be in an organization where they might actually get orders to take. But I certainly hope that people can look at the example of a successful movement like the movement against apartheid South Africa and try to replicate what worked.
And I should also say, speaking of South Africa, is that apartheid inaugurated formally in 1948, which is not to say that racism and bias did not exist before 1948, but this was a new stage. And explicitly, what it involved was trying to lift up poor Afrikaners, the poor descendants of the original Dutch settlers who had an infusion from fleeing French Protestants at the end of the 17th century, to lift them up by giving them privileges and benefits so that they would be less prone to engage in solidarity with Africans, for example. And to a degree that worked, insofar as it did help to solidify a right-wing base, but it didn't work insofar as apartheid became a term of opprobrium, a term of detestation, something to rally the international community around. And so ultimately it backfired in the long run, although in the short term, it was, quote, successful, unquote.
Yeah, exactly. And I think also we have we have too much the tendency to tweet about all the things that are happening in Palestine, which in my opinion just functions as a pacifier. I think the whole internet and tweeting culture is functioning as a pacifier when it comes to resistance. Anyway, I think this was great again, Professor Horn. We learned a lot, and the hour goes very fast. So I hope one day in the future we can continue this talk. But for now, we wish you a pleasant evening.
Yeah, thank you. And be sure to send me the link.
Absolutely, as usual.
Absolutely. Yeah, thanks for taking the time.
Yeah, thank you. Good luck to you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Have a good one.
You too.